So for the month of July, we're moving on to a new and equally confusing topic for our worship in Tapestry. Our theme for July will be liberal theologies. Now, you've probably heard me use the word liberal faith before. Unitarian Universalists talk about our liberal faith tradition a lot, but we don't do a very good job of explaining what that means very well. Although Unitarian Universalists tend to be politically left of center, the idea of a liberal theology has nothing to do with politics. When I say liberal, at least in terms of theology, I'm talking about liberalism as an ideology. It's a product of the Enlightenment and the 18th century. The word liberal itself comes from the Latin root of liberalis, or free. The dictionary says liberal is free from bigotry or unreasonable prejudice in favor of traditional opinions or established institutions, or open to the reception of new ideas or proposals of reform. So when we talk about a liberal faith tradition or liberal theology, then we're talking about a commitment to act freely in figuring out what is true and what is false. Liberal faith is about not taking for granted what we've been told by an authority. It's a commitment to look deeply at all the information available and seek the truth, even if it's an unpleasant one. And it comes to us from this distinct moment in history, sort of the modern age, along with the scientific method and this understanding that we can gather data from the world around us and then generalize about what is true. And you might be thinking, of course, this is what we do. We think through what we believe, and reason helps us to live out our faith in better ways. But that hasn't always been the case. For a very long time in our own religious past, people believed that we humans could develop faith only through a gift from God. Our predecessors believed that we were so misguided as humans that our only way that we could find faith or moral action was as a gift from God, through the church. Too much reason would get in the way. It would lead us to pride and lead us away from the holy. But more and more in the 1800s, people started questioning that tradition, and pretty soon a huge controversy arose. It was called the Unitarian Controversy. That's actually what they named this period in history. And it grew directly out of this colonial American religious experience. In the early 1800s, this huge shift emerged as people started applying history and literary analysis to the Bible, and clergy started asking scientific questions about religion. Other people got very, very concerned. And a division started between Orthodox churches and liberal churches. And in the midst of that division, the Orthodox started calling the liberals Unitarians. They meant it as an insult, because doubting the doctrine of the Trinity was the most unthinkable and awful thing you could do. So they called them Unitarians. Finally, in 1818, William Ellery Channing, who we heard from a minute ago, preached the sermon, Unitarian Christianity. And for the first time, someone took that word, Unitarian, and turned it into an identity. In that sermon, he outlined what it meant to be a liberal Christian for himself and for his peers. And for the first time, he said, yes, we liberals believe something different. And Channing ushered in a whole new era of American religion. It's an incredibly long and complicated story, and I'm not going to go into it other than to say that there were two major points of that sermon. First, Channing insisted that we have to use reason to develop our faith. After all, we're developed with this great capacity for reason. We should use it. And secondly, he said that we humans are capable of moral development based on our own reason and our own efforts. So number one, we should use our reason and faith, and number two, that reason can guide us to greater morality. He took a huge risk in preaching this sermon. He had no idea how this thing would unfold, but within a few years, Unitarians had taken over control of Harvard Divinity School, and by 1900, about 250 of the original Puritan churches were calling themselves Unitarian. Now, this is sort of a complicated history, a history of liberalism and the Unitarian controversy of America. So to round things out, I want to draw your attention back to another riveting story. It's a story about squirrels. Yes, it's the story that we heard earlier during our Time for All Ages. Now remember, this was the story of how some squirrels began to wonder about the fastest way to get to the top of the tree. So they had a race. They tried to measure the path to find which was the fastest, the best, the true path. Now the liberal faith tradition of our history would have said that these squirrels were doing a very good thing. They were using their intellect to search for the truth. By deliberating and measuring, they were gaining knowledge about how to live in the world and, of course, metaphorically, how to climb higher and faster. But that's not quite how today's story ended, was it? No, these squirrels scrambled all over the place. Thank you so much. Some leapt through the air from adjacent trees, and some squirrels got distracted by acorns along the way. My favorite description is of the squirrel that wound his way up the trunk like a corkscrew, because I think I feel like that a lot of the time. The most serious two squirrels, though, stuck to their task of finding the fastest, true path to the top. But in the end, everyone found their own way, and that was okay. Everyone found their own truth, and that was okay. It's a nice story, and we're comfortable with that because this is a children's story. It's about squirrels and a metaphor for different faith ideas. But the story is also a great invitation for us to look more carefully at how we understand truth in our own lives. The squirrel story describes our world today a lot better than the Unitarian controversy of our history. In a lot of ways, we Unitarian Universalists still hold on to that 1800s liberal history. We're stuck insisting that there is one fastest, true, best way to the top of the tree. But that's not the world we live in anymore. So far we've been talking about theology and squirrel stories. It's kind of abstract stuff. So I want to bring this down to earth and down into our living rooms. Now more than ever in human history, we find very different truths in the same world. With the multiplicity of cable news stations and even more so with the internet, we can find different news sources. And they tell us very different stories. You used to have a few standard nightly news programs and a few newspapers that told a similar story. But that isn't the case anymore. A whole generation of people have come of age in a world where they can shop for facts that they believe. They can, and we can, seek out a vision of truth that resonates with our own experience of the world. Now, of course, we're inclined to say, my news is the real news. Those others are just making stuff up and trying to sell things. And it's true that some news is more legitimately researched than others, but still, most of them are basing those stories on factual information. Blaming the other side for fabricating their facts or cooking their numbers isn't productive, and more importantly, it's not accurate. There's no Dr. Evil somewhere sitting in his lair, stroking his hairless cat, thinking, ha ha ha, I've fooled them all, as he manipulates the media. When Fox News anchors or when MSNBC news anchors report their stories, they tell the story that they believe. They tell their truth based on similar facts. Now, the children's story about those squirrels gets a lot more serious when we bring it home, doesn't it? Those squirrels knew something, after all. There's more than one way to get to the top of the tree, and more than one vision of the best way, the true way, to see the truth. Now, a lot of you, I think, know that I spent the past couple of weeks traveling in Oklahoma. I was there to attend a class and to visit my family. And visiting Oklahoma for me is always a helpful reminder that there are some very different ways of understanding the world that we share. The day before I left to come home to California, I landed in a conversation with my brother on the topic of gun regulation. Grumble, grumble, grumble. So to give you some context, my brother is the sales director for a company that manufactures and sells these gun simulators to military and police forces for their target practice. And this conversation arose as my dad was saying something about getting his permit to carry a concealed weapon. My brother is very passionate about his right to own a gun and to carry it. He's passionate about it because he believes that it will help him protect himself and his family from dangerous people. We went on and on in the conversation, and recalling it honestly makes me a little bit nauseous every time I think about it. Slowly I realized that my brother's world and mine were somewhat different. We hold a different truth. The conversation eventually turned to a real-life scenario that had happened there in Tulsa not long before. A 70-year-old man was being followed in his car by an erratic and aggressive driver. So the older man pulled his car over to confront the other driver. They got out of their cars. The conversation became an argument in which the younger man became aggressive, and the older man shot and killed the aggressive driver, who it turns out was using meth. Complicated story, huh? I'm embarrassed to say this, but my brother's interpretation of this scenario was gratitude that the 70-year-old had had a gun to protect himself. I suggested that perhaps the 70-year-old man would not have gotten out of his car to confront an erratic stranger if he hadn't had a gun in his hand. I said that perhaps pulling over to confront another person in the first place was the problem. I said that instead of handing out guns to people to protect themselves, we should encourage them to avoid physical confrontations in the first place. And my brother's response was, "That's just not the world we live in." That's just not the world we live in. And eventually something clicked. I realized that not only did my brother and I see the world differently, but that I'm very proud of the way that I choose to see my world. My brother believes in a world where physical violence on the streets is unavoidable. But I believe that it is possible for two adult men to avoid physical violence, even when one of them is aggressive. I believe it's possible, even likely, that a person would choose to de-escalate a confrontation and take a nonviolent stance. And I'm glad to believe in that vision of a world where moral action is encouraged. I choose to understand my world that way because it's a vision of truth that enables moral action for myself and for other people. At the end of the day, my brother and I hold very different truths. But we're working from the same facts. But I hold my truth because it encourages compassion and growth of human spirit. The way I understand the debate about guns isn't based exclusively on statistics or reports. It isn't based on what any particular news coverage offers me as the truth. It's based on a vision of how I want to live my life in a moral way. I believe in a world where goodness is possible, and that shapes the truth that I see. Now, William Ellery Channing and his Unitarian contemporaries believe that getting the right facts led to a singular truth. They thought that reason and research could lead us to faith and to moral development. For Channing, and for a lot of Unitarianism today, human goodness was anchored in our capacity to discern the truth and then act on it. But philosophers and physicists and theologians question that liberal equation more and more. It's becoming more and more apparent that pure reason doesn't have the capacity to lead to moral action and faith. In today's world of multiple truths, that liberal equation of the Unitarian controversy is no longer working. Now, I'm not willing to give up on human goodness or on moral action or on the pursuit of knowledge. I think all three of those things are essential. But it seems to me that it's time to rearrange the pieces, that our morality is the lens through which we begin to understand what is true. Instead of starting with raw data and facts, perhaps we should start with a more moral question. Like, what vision of truth calls us to live more compassionately? What vision of the world empowers us to be more loving people? I know that putting scientific truth in the backseat is very scary. I know losing our grip of a singular truth is terrifying and probably seems insane to many of us. But please consider that the Unitarian controversy of the 1800s was about letting go of another way of understanding the world. It was a scary and radical leap forward. And it may be time for us as Unitarian Universalists to let go of the death grip that we have on scientific truth. It may be time for us to prioritize our ethics before we assemble a vision of the truth. Because if faith can teach us anything, it's that the most important things in life are the ones that are immeasurable. Now, taking our history seriously doesn't mean believing what our predecessors did. Taking our history seriously means being inspired by their courage to expand their hearts and their minds. So as we leave here today, as we go out into a world awash in statistics and facts, as we return home to Sunday papers and turn on the news and even look at Facebook later today, I invite you to witness the versions of truth that we swim in. The same facts are used to create very different pictures of the truth. And I hope before you sink into one particular version of that truth, I hope that you will consider how that interpretation, how that truth calls you to more compassionate living. Amen.